Welcome to the Mental Fitness Podcast in partnership with NUE, that's NUE, where we explore real tools and stories for building mental strength in the modern world.
All right. If you've ever felt stuck in your own head, today's guest has spent decades studying one of the most simplest tools humans have, putting emotionally significant experiences into words.
Dr. James Pennebaker is a professor emeritus at UT Austin and pioneered research in the 1980s showing that expressive writing honestly about your deepest thoughts and feelings, can improve mental and even physical health. He's authored hundreds of articles and multiple books, including Opening Up by Writing It Down. Welcome to the show, Dr. Pennebaker.
It's nice to be here. Thank you.
So jumping right in, I remember first being exposed to this idea, some of your work many, many years ago, long before podcast was even a thing, and the idea that writing, expressing things that we've been through in words, just the act of writing it out into words can be so powerful. How did you get started in this kind of research? What drew you to it?
It was funny. Nothing drew me to it. I was busy studying other things at the time. And I came across a couple of interesting findings. One of them was that I was interested in physical health and when people get sick and how they notice their bodies. And I passed out a questionnaire to hundreds of people, asking them all about their life experiences, because I was trying to find out what kind of people report high rates of physical symptoms. And I got together with a group of my students and I said, listen, we're going to come up with this questionnaire. And unlike other research, let's ask people anything we want. So there was a group, these were undergraduates, and they said, how about get a sense of what people eat? Ooh, how about this? How do you get along with your parents? How do you get along with your mother and your father, et cetera? Do you have pets growing up? And one of the people said, what about, have you ever had a traumatic sexual experience prior to the age of 17? I thought, that sounds like a good one. So we put that on, and the questionnaire was, went on forever. It was 12 pages, and we passed it out to hundreds of people. And that one sexual trauma question was endorsed by about 15% of the people. Now, these were college students, and the people who endorsed it had far more health problems than any other question that we had on the questionnaire. And about that time, I was asked to work with the magazine Psychology Today, and back then that was a hot magazine, that they were going to be doing an article on my work on physical symptoms, and they were going to have a questionnaire associated with the article. And I said, put this traumatic sexual question and a few others on it as well. And they got 24,000 people who filled it out and sent it in, which of course is not a random sample. And I ended up randomly getting a group of about 2,000 of those and analyzing them. And again, we found 22% of women and 11% of men reporting having had a traumatic sexual experience prior to 17. And they were twice as likely to have been hospitalized for any cause in the previous year. They're more likely to have been diagnosed with cancer, high blood pressure, colds, flus, ulcers, everything. And this was kind of an older sample than college students. The average age was almost 40 years old. So here was a major trauma that people that had a particular effect, which then led me to ask the question, is it something about a traumatic sexual experience? And it turned out that people tend to keep secrets about these traumatic sexual experiences. In some later questionnaires with hundreds of people, we found that having any kind of traumatic experience that you keep secret was associated with health problems. In other words, there's something really toxic about secrets. And that's what led me to, if this is so bad for you, what if we just brought people in the laboratory and had them tell us about their traumatic experiences? But I didn't want to have them talk because I didn't know how to respond. So it occurred to me, we'll just bring them in and have them write about it. And that was kind of the birth of all of this. So I started off studying this thing over here, and this finding slapped me in the face. And I realized, well, this will get at, does in some way writing about, talking about, expressing a deep secret. Could this have any health benefits?
So just saying back one thing I think I heard you say, what initially stood out in the data was having had a traumatic sexual experience. What you later realized is that it's really more about a traumatic experience that was kept secret. It just, the nature of our society and things is that type of trauma is usually kept secret. But it's really the secrets are toxic.
That's right. And then later on, as I got more deeply into this, I started to realize it wasn't necessarily traumatic. It was any kind of upsetting experience, anything that you find yourself tossing and turning about, that you think about too much, that's getting in the way of your life. It could be a fight with your boss. It could be a relationship problem with your spouse or somebody that you're dating, or it could be issues of feeling, not appreciated at work or not living up to your own expectations. It could be anything. It could be, you have a sick pet, anything that you are really upset about, but you feel so other people don't want to hear about it, or they can't hear about it, or it would make you look bad in other people's eyes, or you're too embarrassed to talk about it.
So the question became, if holding it in harms us, what happens if we bring it out safely through writing?
Kind of. And this is the interesting issue. What you just said is, I think, the way that many people think about this, that you're holding it in and it's like this cauldron, a pot that's boiling with the lid on, and by letting the steam out, you'll be better. That metaphor I learned was not what the issue was. It was really more that by not talking about it, you're not thinking about it. You're not putting it together. You're not understanding it. And one thing that happens when we have an upsetting experience is, as you tell other people about it, you hear it and you're kind of forced to put the pieces together in ways that we don't do if we don't talk about it. So I remember, having some upsetting experiences during the time that this was all occurring. I didn't want to talk to anybody else about it. I was walking down the street, and then some feature of that experience came into my mind, and I think, oh, I wish I'd said this. Or then I'd think about some other aspect of it, and, ooh, I'm really pissed off at that person. But I didn't put it all together. And what writing or even talking to other people can do is it forces you to bring together all these different parts of, often it's a really complicated experience.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it's almost like, bringing together the story, right, of the experience in your own way. So maybe let's help us define what expressive writing is and what it isn't, right? Because it's not, journaling in its general sense, or gratitude journaling. Like, this is very specific, almost something you'll have in your back pocket that you're not going to use every day, right? So what is expressive writing?
So you're exactly right. This is not journaling. By doing this, you are not committing the rest of your life to writing all the time. It's more, I view this as a very simple short-term solution to sometimes a permanent solution to certain kinds of problems.
Right.
The first study was one where we had people come into the laboratory. It was a fairly small study, only about 45 people that were in it. And among other things, they were randomly, by a flip of the coin, asked to write either about a really traumatic experience in their lives, ideally one they hadn't talked to other people about, or the other half of the people were told to write about superficial topics, the shoes they're wearing, their living room, things like that. And they were asked to write about those topics for 4 days, about 15 minutes each day, and they did it in the laboratory. So they came into the lab. I or somebody else would talk to them and say, okay, you're going to be in this experiment for 4 days. When you go into this room that you'll be by yourself, I want you to really let go and explore your deepest thoughts and feelings about an upsetting experience. And in writing about this, you might tie it to other issues in your life, maybe relationships with your family or your parents or your people that you're involved with now, or you might tie it into your work or your job or school. And you could write about the same trauma every day, or you could write about a different one each day. And many people have never had a trauma, but all of us have had major stressors or conflicts, and you can write about those as well. But in your writing, don't worry about grammar or sentence structure. This is for you and you alone. I do ask that you, when you're finished, put this your writing in a box, and we'll never link it to you. But the important issue is to really let go and to write the entire time and be as honest as you can. And that was essentially it. And then they'd come in the next day. We'd say, okay, this time we want you to do the same thing. You could write about a different topic, or you could write about the same. But again, really let go and explore your deepest thoughts and feelings. And that was it.
And why deepest thoughts and feelings? What makes that level of honesty different from like surface writing?
I was going on intuition. It's important to know I am not a clinical psychologist. I have no training in helping people. I was trained as a social psychologist. And so a lot of this was just intuitive, which is I wanted people to stop and to introspect and think about and look at what's going on. And, I had by the time I was doing this early research, I was in my early 30s. I'd been married for several years, and anybody who's been married for more than, let's say, a couple of weeks has had ups and downs in a relationship. That's just the nature of life. And I remember going through one of those really dark periods with my wife, and at some point I just went into a place to write, and I just sat down writing about, so what's going on here? Why am I feeling this? Why is she feeling this? How do I deal with this? So writing it all down, this reminds me of such and such. And I did that, and as soon as I finished, I just remember coming out of that room feeling light. It was as though everything made sense. And now I went in, and my wife and I started talking, and it made a huge difference. And by the way, we've been married for over 50 years now, so it must have worked.
Yeah.
And turns out I've needed to do that more than once over the last 50 years.
Yeah, that's awesome. So a question, confidentiality in the writing, is there something about knowing that no one else is going to read it? Or
I think the important issue is if you think someone's going to read it and judge you and link it to you in some way, that makes it so you can't be as honest. And when I'm working with individuals with this expressive writing, I tell them, I want you to do this writing as though you're going to throw it out as soon as you're finished. You're going to tear it up, you're going to burn it, whatever. Now, frankly, that's not my issue. If you're doing it for yourself, the primary issue is if you decide to keep it, you need to keep it someplace that is safe, that other people won't read it. Because very often you're keeping it secret for a reason. Because if other people found it, their feelings could be hurt. They may hate you because of what you're writing. But it's critical for this to be brutally honest with yourself.
wow, that's powerful. One other thing that stood out to me from what you were saying is you had him come in the lab for 4 days and write, but this isn't ongoing. You want to just talk a little bit about like the dose and frequency, that this isn't necessarily, you need to have the habit of doing this every single day for a year. It's more for a period of time to process a certain situation, right?
Right. So when I started off, the only reason we had people write for 4 days, 15 minutes a day was because I did the calculations of how many rooms I had, how many people who were helping me, and I could only run at the university. I could get the rooms only from 5 to 10 p.m. And I did all this arithmetic and I came out, okay, 4 times, 15 minutes a time. And we did the entire study in 4 days. So that was the underlying logic and it worked. And then after that, I tried 3 times, 20 minutes a time. That worked. And then we did 5 times, 30 minutes a time. That worked. And then other labs started doing it. And some people just had to do it 2 times. Some people had to do it 5 times. Many it was 3 and 4 times. And sometimes it was 30 minutes, sometimes 20 minutes, 15, 10. There's even been a few studies where people just write 2 minutes on different times.
And that was equally effective, 2 minutes?
Equally effective. And the other issue that I do when I'm talking to people, I say, look, I can't guarantee that this will work, but try it. And promise yourself that you'll at least write for 3 days, at least 15 minutes a day. And if after the end of a couple of days, you don't feel any better because of the writing, maybe it just doesn't work for you this time. And try something else. Go jogging. Go find somebody to talk to. In other words, this often works. The research is very clear. It often works for most people. But sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes for me, when I write, I feel better and feel as though it's been really valuable. Sometimes it's not. So the other issue that I tell everybody, there is not one true way. Experiment. See what works for you. And the other issue, one reason my original idea was I didn't want this to be a lifelong experience of writing every day about traumatic experiences. My concern is if you write too much, you start to get into a ruminative cycle.
Yeah, right.
And I think that would be, worse than not writing. That the idea is, let's fix this sucker. And if in a few days you're writing and it's not fixing it, then it's not working and you need to try something else.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's a good point there. We're talking about writing here. What about other modalities? I mean, what about typing, right? Or voice?
Yeah.
Or
So there have been studies comparing writing and typing. They both work.
Okay.
Talking into a tape recorder, that shows to work. I think having people just outside talking to the wind can work. And of course, talking to another person who is not judgmental, it works. In other words, and we often, I've always been interested in people talking to a stranger on a plane or a bus or a train or something like that. That can work. Again, when you're talking to these strangers, they don't know you, you don't know them. And that just the mere putting this into words can be really beneficial. And by the way, I think AI can be very beneficial as well.
Yeah, interesting. So question on that, just on we started off talking about how secrets are toxic and traumatic experiences kept secret, that's what harms us. And so when we write about it, or like we just said, talk about it or talk to a stranger about it, it takes away that secrecy. But you're saying that even happens even if we're writing about it and no other human being ever reads it, or we're talking to, like, say, an AI and no other human being reads it. What is it about formulating those thoughts into words, or what's your intuition on why that is so healing?
So we've done and other labs have done lots of research on this. And I think the picture that's emerging is putting things into words forces some kind of structure, some kind of organization, and some kind of understanding. In other words, by writing about it and tying it into other issues in your life, looking at patterns in your life, all of this gives us a sense of what the problem is, how we're reacting to it, and gives us a different perspective. And this is essentially what learning is. If you think about how is it you learn to, fix a broken bowl, and you've never done it before, and a broken bowl is not a particularly good example, but the idea is when you're trying to figure something out that is really hard to figure out, putting it into words helps you to do it. It helps you to remember it afterwards.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I want to go back to something you said earlier where, these college students were answering these questions and you realize the connection of traumatic experiences and poor physical health symptoms reoccurring in their life, right? How does putting an experience into words change the body, like immune function, stress response, and things of that nature?
So I forgot to mention this because this is the most important part. That very first study, and actually all the studies I did after that, we got their permission to track their health records and visits to the doctor in the months before and the months after writing. And so we were able to get real doctor visits, and the health center provided just how many times they'd been to the doctor in the weeks and months before and after. It was it illness related, injury related, was it checkups and so forth. The primary difference was on illness visits. And for college students, they are overwhelmingly, colds, flus, headaches, upset stomachs, kind of daily issues. But why does it make a difference? Well, there's a lot of issues. If you are really suffering because you're dealing with some kind of conflict or trauma in your life, you don't sleep very well. The other issue is you don't think very well. And we sometimes fail to appreciate that when we're obsessing about something, that is eating up a lot of the capacity of our brain. We don't focus as well. We're more likely to have accidents. We're more likely to trip over something. There's all of these problems that occur. And also our immune system is thrown out of kilter when we're under this long-term, sometimes low-level stress. So what this writing does is it essentially organizes these experiences, and now your brain doesn't need to think about them as much. And in other words, it stills the mind. And that's what I think is what its real benefit is.
Interesting. So this subset of students that had twice the number of health problems than the students that hadn't had the traumatic experiences, after the writing, their visits to the doctor dropped.
Well, I think the way to think about it is beforehand, everybody was going to the doctor at the same rate. And then after writing, the people who wrote, they went to the health center at half the rate as the people who did not write. In other words, so this is bringing about an improvement in health. And the next study we did, I did this with Jan Kiko Glazer and Ron Glazer, who were psychoneuroimmunologists. This was a really hot new area at the time. We drew blood before they were assigned a condition, after the last day of writing, and then 6 weeks later. And we found that people who wrote about these traumatic experiences showed changes in immune function consistent with better health.
That's amazing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We've talked about this on other episodes that, like you said, this low level state of chronic stress can actually increase inflammation just generally in your body, right? Which causes sickness, impacts your sleep, like you said. So it's this cascading effect in your life, right?
And it's linked to depression. And I should say, there have now been over 2,000 studies on expressive writing.
Wow.
You pioneered this field. You created it.
I know, it's very exciting. And what's interesting about it is, this is not a product. You don't have to buy anything. It doesn't hurt if you buy a pen and some paper, but you can use your computer, and you can do it any way you want. And some people will try writing with the right hand versus their left hand. Other people will try to write it in verse. Other people will try to write, in different ways. And my recommendation: experiment. See what works best for you.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. There's a question when I was doing more research and preparing for this. You've done your research on pronouns is fascinating. What does the use of, I versus we reveal about, depression, resilience, things like that.
So on the surface, this sounds like we're talking about something very different. In fact, this is the same, how I started off with this questionnaire on physical symptoms and then found the secrets and traumas and so forth, and then writing. I was trying to figure out, why does writing work? And my lab and other labs were coming up with all sorts of hypotheses. We were testing it. And at some point, it occurred to me, maybe we should be looking at what people are writing about and how they're writing. And so we started looking at these essays, and we realized this was just too complex for humans to figure out. And I thought, well, we just need to go buy a computer program that can analyze language. And this was, by the way, this was in the early 1990s. And it turns out there wasn't such a thing.
WordNet from Princeton, maybe?
That existed at the time, but that wouldn't have been very helpful for the kinds of essays that we were dealing with. And so I needed a program that could tell me, is this person using causal thinking? Is this person, expressing certain types of emotions? Are they trying to understand what's going on? There are all these dimensions. And I couldn't find any programs, and I ended up talking to some of the early computational linguists. And I realized, well, I'll just write the program myself. And, I had taken a little computer programming in college. And as it happened, I had a graduate student working with me whose undergraduate degree had been in computer science, Martha Francis. And Martha and I, mostly Martha, ended up writing a simple computer program that would go into any given text and calculate the percentage of words that were, say, anger words or sadness words, or cognitive dimensions in terms of kind of self-reflection or reflection or other things. And it also, as long as we were writing it, we put in parts of speech. So we had, pronouns and prepositions, articles, conjunctions, and other words. Kind of like I have no clinical training, I have absolutely no training in language or linguistics, and I still don't know linguistics, and I feel very comfortable about that. I'm a very busy man, and so we went in and started to analyze data from our studies and other studies to get a sense of, are there certain dimensions of language that might predict changes in physical health. And also, and the bottom line is, we did find some differences, and one of them was, the most important was that people who benefited tend to use an increasing number of cognitive words that suggest thinking. So self-reflective words like think, believe, understand, meaning, words such as that, or causal words, because, cause, effect, reason, rationale, and other words that are saying, I now think, as I think about this, those people are the ones who tend to benefit. And there were some other emotion differences, but they were fairly modest. But I also came across something that early on that blew me away. By now, this was the mid-90s, the world was changing in terms of the computers. And around the United States, a large percentage of the American population got something in the mail that was a floppy disk from a company called America Online, AOL. And if you had a computer at home and a modem, you could put this in your computer and it would connect you to something called the internet. And this was unbelievable. And what this wild thing did was, they had set up these essentially chat groups. And the chat groups were either for 20 people or 40 people. And you could start writing in it, and you could talk to people all over the world. This was incredible. So I started to go to these chat groups and started downloading. So you could download the conversation that you're in. And, once the kids were in bed, I would go to the computer and I'd go to, one day I'd go to one kind of chat group and another kind of chat group and so forth. Then the next morning I would analyze the data, trying to figure out how people use language. And I discovered, one of the first things I did was looking at males versus females. And I figured, well, let's start off with something simple. I words, first person singular pronouns, I, me, and my. And I believed, as almost everybody did, that men would use I words at a much higher rate than women because men are much more narcissistic, self-congratulatory and so forth. And what I discovered was women use I words at much higher rates than men across countries, across language, across all these different settings. It made no sense. And then I thought, okay, let's look at we words, we, us, and ours. Again, I thought obviously women use that more. There was no difference between men and women.
Wow.
There were big differences in cognitive words, because, cause, effect, reason, rationale, words such as that. Of course, men use those words. No, women use those words at much higher rates than men did.
Interesting.
And articles, prepositions. Well, I didn't know who would use that, but there's a big sex difference, and the people who use those are men. The only thing that came out, as I expected, was that social words, making references to other people, he, she, they, words such as that, women use those words at much higher rate than men. And since then, there have been dozens, maybe hundreds of studies showing these same kinds of effects. What language did not work the way I thought it did. So I words do not reflect narcissism, self-importance. In fact, men are more narcissistic and self-important, but they don't use I words more. We use I words when we are self-reflective. If you're thinking about yourself, you use I words. If you're writing an essay and you're in front of a mirror, you'll use more I words in your essay than if you're not in front of a mirror. And if you're self-conscious, you use I words more. And if people are looking at you, you use I words more. And if you're depressed, you use I words more. And in fact, we found that suicidal poets use more I words in their poetry than poets who are not suicidal. In other words, language was working really, really differently than I ever thought of it, never ever realized. And these cognitive words and these articles and prepositions reflect the content of what we're writing about. So if you're writing about objects and things, in terms of how does a car work, what is the best way to grow certain kinds of plants, where you're dealing with objects and things, you're using a lot of nouns and you're using articles and prepositions because you use those with nouns. Males talk about objects and things much more than women do. We like to talk about things out there in the real world. We don't like to talk much about things too personal. Overall, women, oddly, they're interested in other human beings. They are really interested in people. And it turns out people are a lot more complex than objects and things. And so if you're trying to understand, the best way to grow plants, it doesn't take much expertise for you to now start to talk about, this plant requires this, blah, 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 blah. But if you're talking about human relationships are much more complex. Why is it that Maria dumped Fred for Sally? That doesn't make any sense. Well, maybe it's this. In other words, as you're talking about other human beings, you need much more complex mental models. You need to think about them more complexly. And so all of a sudden, it allowed me to start to think about how these words are reflecting how people think. And this then started to unfold as we got more and more deeply into the expressive writing, that the people who were benefiting, not only were they increasing in their use of these cognitive words, where they're working through issues more, They also changed in their pronouns so that people who benefited from writing, one day they would use a lot of I words, and the next day they might use other kinds of pronouns, we, he, she, and the next day I words, almost as though they're changing perspectives, that the people who benefit change perspectives over time.
All right, this show is all about mental fitness, and here's something most of us don't admit. Everyone has those moments when you feel overwhelmed, stuck, or unsure, and what's actually going on in your head. That's why we built New. New is a mental fitness platform designed to help you clear your thoughts, reflect, notice patterns, develop habits, and get support that fits who you are. It remembers your goals, your wins, the things you're working on, and helps you stay on track. Not therapy, not toxic positivity, just real support when you need it. If you want to be part of the early access group, head to talkwithnew.com. That's talkwithnue.com. Sign up now and get 3 months free. So that 4 to 5 day period where people are writing, you could, by analyzing the language they're using, the types of words, you could see that whether they were progressing or not. That's fascinating. How the words we use, both the gender differences, but also just generally as I move from a more depressed state to a less depressed state, I might change the types of words that I'm using.
That's right.
Wow. Well, one thing that we really like to do in the Mental Fitness Podcast as much as possible, and I think this is more obvious than others, but we try to provide some practical application for our listeners on how they can incorporate this. And I think we've already kind of talked about that, but maybe if you just in sort of 30 seconds summarize, if someone's feeling, what would be sort of the recommended way to start? The 4 days, 15 minutes, 3 days, 20 minutes, like what would you kind of suggest?
So I'm much looser than that. Here's the first issue. Are you finding yourself thinking about something too much? Are you waking up in the middle of the night obsessing about something too much? Listen, just get up and go find a place where you're by yourself and just start writing. Write about your deepest thoughts and feelings about this issue that you are thinking about, and explore it. Why do you think you're feeling this way? When has it happened before? What do you think would be beneficial for you? What is this saying about you? In other words, just write. Plan to write for 15 or 20 minutes. If you write more, that's fine. If you write less, that's fine as well. And then when you're finished, think about it a little bit to yourself. Go back to bed. Go take a walk. And if you found this beneficial, try it again tomorrow. And the third day, fourth day. Write as much as you need. This is not something you need to do or even should do for too often. You don't want to get in any kind of ruminative cycle. This is for you to figure out what's going on. You know what the problem is better than anybody else. Try it out. And if it doesn't work, think seriously of talking to a therapist. Think seriously of talking to a friend, or, take a few days off and go jogging more or something like that. Or, talk to AI. But I cannot emphasize enough, there is no one true way. And you need to experiment, which is not what, I think a lot of people want me to provide them with. This, I am the guru. This is the way you do it, and send me money. But I'm just not going to do that.
I like that, and I like that that almost makes it simpler and easier, the less structured it is. But one thing you mentioned there that I think is really important is that we each know what's going on inside of us better than anyone else. And sometimes just writing it out and gives us the opportunity to organize it, and we solve it ourselves. And sometimes we don't, and we might need to see a therapist who's professionally trained in how to help us work through that. But I love that, starting with writing.
Yes. And you'll find many therapists out there will have you do expressive writing while you're in therapy.
Yeah, right. It's a tool that they use. Well, one thing we like to do sort of at the conclusion of our episodes is we just have about 5 questions, just rapid fire questions. We just ask a question and you just say sort of the first thing that comes to your mind. So as it relates to writing, a prompt you return to when life is heavy.
My own prompt is just, for me, is what the hell is going on? Why am I feeling this way?
Love that. What do you think is the most misunderstood or biggest misconception about expressive writing?
I think one of the big ones is the ones that you kind of alluded to at the beginning, that what this is blowing off steam, that if you just blow off steam, that you'll be helped. It's not at all about blowing off steam. It's about trying to understand what's going on.
Okay, best time of day to write, if there is a best time of day.
There is not a best time of day. The best time of day is when you are able to find a place and time where you're not going to be bothered.
One writing mistake people make that could turn into rumination.
One is writing over and over and over again for days, weeks, months, trying to uncover or understand this one issue you're dealing with. I don't think that's beneficial. After 4 or 5 days, if you haven't reached some kind of satisfactory answer or resolution, try something else. The other, which I haven't talked about, immediately after a major upheaval, if someone close to you has unexpectedly died, you've been traumatized or whatever, you may not feel like writing. Don't write. If you feel as though you do need to write, do. But I don't push people to write too soon after an upheaval. Very often you need some kind of distance. One thing I encourage people, this is my rule for writing. If you think if you are thinking about something too much, writing may be beneficial. If you have had a major trauma in the last 2 or 3 days and you're thinking about it all the time, that's probably not too much. That's probably pretty normal. In other words, don't flood yourself with writing when you're already overwhelmed. Give yourself a few days.
So those are really good questions. I think that probably kind of covers the things we wanted to talk about. I'm fascinated by the way you discovered this. I'm reading your book right now, and I'm reading more and more about your work. But I just think that that's such an interesting story how you came across this, but also how you pioneered this whole area and how incredible expressive writing can be and helpful.
Well, thank you. Yeah, no, it's really been fun to be able to be part of this roller coaster ride.
Well, thank you, Dr. Pennebaker, for being with us on the Mental Fitness Podcast, and hopefully we'll be able to keep in touch and continue to talk to you.
It's been fun talking to you guys.
Yeah, thank you so much.